Everyone thinks they want to catch a monster. I see it in the forums, I hear it in the bars. You guys talk about thermal scopes, scent blockers, and high-caliber rounds like you're shopping for a video game. You think if you buy the right gear, you become the apex predator. You think that if you actually trap a werewolf, the story ends with you standing over a trophy. I'm here to tell you that you are dead wrong. I've been a specialized hunter for 15 years. I know every trick in the book. But the only reason I'm still alive to record this is because I learned the hard way that winning in the deep woods is a lie. You want to know what happens when you finally outsmart a werewolf. You find out that while you were staring at the trap, the pack was staring at you. My name is Carlos Carrillo. If you're listening to this, pour yourself something strong and keep the lights low. You're going to need it. I am not a storyteller. I am a survivalist. For the last decade and a half, I have made my living tracking things that science refuses to acknowledge. I've tracked them through the swamps of Louisiana and the granite peaks of the Rockies. I have the scars on my face and the gray in my beard to prove that I know what I'm doing. For a long time, I was arrogant. I was a man who slept with a loaded rifle and believed that predator meant a bear or a mountain lion, animals that act on instinct. I didn't believe in monsters that could plan. I didn't believe in things that could organize a military-style ambush. But that changed last month. I'm going to tell you the story of the night I finally got what I wanted. The night I finally trapped a werewolf. I had the tactical advantage, I had the element of surprise, and I had the perfect kill box. But I didn't know that out there, in the silence of the snow, catching one of them was exactly what they wanted me to do. Wilson Michaels was the kind of man who didn't just survive the woods, he seemed to have been carved out of them. He was 60 when I met him, a hard-bitten tracker with eyes like cracked flint, and a silence about him that was louder than shouting. He was the one who took me from a 25-year-old construction worker with a curiosity about the unexplained and turned me into something lethal. He taught me how to mask my scent with pine pitch and wood ash until I smelled like the tree line itself. He taught me that stillness is a weapon, that patience cuts deeper than any knife. But the most important thing Wilson ever taught me, the lesson he drilled into my skull over campfires that burned low and blue in the dead of winter, was about the nature of the enemy. He'd lean in, the firelight catching the deep grooves of his face, and say, "Carlos, you listen to me. A bear attacks because it's hungry or scared. A cat attacks because you're prey. But these things, they attack because they've already won." He would take a long drag from his roll-up and exhale smoke into the freezing air. And remember this, if you're tracking a lone male and the woods go quiet, you check your six, because if you can't see the pack, they're already behind you. I revered the man. I memorized his lessons like scripture, but time has a funny way of eroding caution. 15 years of hunting, 15 years of close calls and confirmed sightings, and I started to believe I had graduated. I started to think the rules were for rookies. I looked at my scars and my reinforced gear, my thermal optics and my high-caliber rifle, and I convinced myself that I was the one dictating the terms of the engagement. I forgot that in the grand scheme of the wild, 15 years is nothing compared to centuries of evolution. I forgot Wilson's voice. It was that selective amnesia that led me to answer the phone when Joseph Morrow called. Morrow was a landowner up north, the kind of man who owned more acres than he could walk in a week. He wasn't a superstitious man. He was practical, hard-nosed, old money. But when I picked up the line, I heard a tremor in his voice that didn't belong there. He didn't sound angry about losing money. He sounded terrified. He told me he was losing livestock. Not one or two calves to a pack of coyotes, but full-grown steers, 1,000-pound animals that shouldn't go down easy. And they weren't being eaten, not really. He described the scenes with a shaky clinical precision that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The kills were surgical. Massive trauma to the neck, spines snapped like dry twigs, but very little feeding. It was sport. It was a display of dominance. I drove up to his property the next morning to scout the perimeter. The snow was fresh, a blank white canvas that hid nothing. What I found confirmed everything Morrow had feared and everything I had hoped for. The tracks were distinct, bipedal, heavy, with a stride length that no human could replicate without sprinting. The claw marks on the trees were 7 feet up, gouged deep into the hardwood. But it was the isolation of the sign that sold me the lie. Every piece of evidence pointed to a rogue male, a nomad. In the world of cryptid hunting, a rogue male is the holy grail. They are aggressive, yes, but they are solitary. They are prone to mistakes because they don't have the safety net of a clan. I read the signs like I was reading a billboard. I saw a creature that was confident, territorial, and alone. I saw a trophy. I saw the culmination of my career waiting for me in the tree line. I stood there in the biting wind, tracing the edge of a massive paw print with my gloved finger, and I smiled. I thought I had him figured out. I thought I was walking into a duel. If I had just stopped for a second, if I had just listened to the silence of the woods instead of the roar of my own ego, I might have heard Wilson's voice warning me. I might have remembered that if it looks too perfect, it's because it's a setup. But I didn't. I walked back to my truck, called my team, and told them we had a green light. I told them we were going to catch a monster. I didn't know yet that the monster was already waiting for us to set the table. In just a moment, I'm going to introduce you to the crew and take you inside the kill box we built for this thing. But first, if you want to survive more stories from the deep woods, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Trust me, where we're going next, you're going to want the company. You don't hunt a predator like this alone. You might track a deer solo or sit in a turkey blind by yourself. But when you are going after something that can think, calculate, and hold a grudge, you bring a pack of your own. I made the call from the truck, and within 6 hours, the staging area at Morrow's property looked less like a hunting camp and more like a forward operating base. This was the crew I had built over a decade of trial and error. We weren't friends, not in the way people usually use that word. We didn't do barbecues or birthday parties. We were bound by something tighter than friendship. The kind of trust that only comes from knowing the person next to you can keep your heart beating when things go sideways. Noah T. was the first to arrive. He was our intel guy, a man who spent more time staring at topographic maps and migration patterns than he did sleeping. Noah was slight, bespectacled, and looked more like a university librarian than a cryptid hunter, but his mind was a steel trap. He had already cross-referenced Morrow's livestock losses with lunar cycles and local weather patterns. He had the map of the property spread out on the hood of his Jeep before I even parked. "It's tight, Carlos," he said, not bothering with a hello. He traced a ridge line on the map with a pale finger. "The mutilations are moving in a contracting spiral. He's not just wandering, he's patrolling. He's claiming this valley." "A rogue male?" I asked, needing to hear it again. "Textbook," Noah confirmed. "If it were a pack, the kill zone would be wider. This is one big bastard telling the world he owns this dirt." That confirmation was like gasoline on the fire of my ego. We were right. We had the profile. While Noah handled the theory, Sandra Valier was handling the eyes. She was our tech and comms specialist. Sandra didn't talk much. She communicated in nods, hand signals, and the static bursts of a radio. She was currently unloading hard cases from her SUV, thermal repeaters, motion sensors, and high-frequency audio traps. She moved with a jagged, nervous energy, her eyes always scanning the tree line, but her hands were steady as a surgeon's when she was wiring up a motherboard. She was the reason we could see in the dark. She was the reason we wouldn't be surprised, or so I thought. Then there was Thomas. We didn't have a last name for Thomas, and nobody asked. He was our heavy weapons specialist. He stood 6'4" and was built like a refrigerator full of concrete. He was checking the action on a modified semi-automatic shotgun loaded with custom slugs, rounds heavy enough to stop a charging grizzly in its tracks. Thomas was the insurance policy. If the plan failed, if the finesse didn't work, Thomas was the hammer that brought the world crashing down. "Eric's already out," Thomas grunted, nodding toward the dense tree line. Eric Cook was the scout. He was the youngest of us, wiry and fast, with a silence to his movement that even I envied. He was out there now, painting the perimeter with scent blockers and identifying the choke points. He was the bait, and the pointer dog rolled into one. We spent the afternoon establishing the perimeter. It was a symphony of efficiency. We moved through the woods in a loose formation, setting up Sandra's sensors on the game trails Noah had identified. The air was cold, biting at our exposed skin, but the adrenaline kept us warm. Every time we found a sign, a snapped sapling, a disturbed patch of snow, the team would freeze and look to me. That was the dynamic, that was the drug. They were experts in their fields, better than me at their specific jobs. Noah was smarter. Sandra was more technical. Thomas was stronger. Eric was faster. But they all looked to me for the command. I was the conductor. I was the one with the 15 years of confirmed encounters. I was the one they trusted to take the kill shot. When we gathered back at the staging area as the sun began to dip behind the pines, casting long, bruised shadows across the snow, the mood was electric. We felt untouchable. We had the woods wired for sound and heat. We had the heavy artillery. We had the intelligence. "We own the night," Sandra said, looking at her tablet screen where green lights were flickering to life, showing our sensor grid coming online. "He walks right where we want him," Noah added, tapping the map. I looked at them, my crew, my pack. I felt a swell of pride that was so thick it almost choked me. I checked the bolt on my rifle, feeling the cold steel against my palm. "All right," I said, my voice low and steady. "Let's get into position. Tonight we end this." I led them into the dark, confident that I was the alpha in these woods. I didn't realize yet that I was just leading sheep to the slaughter. The kill box was a masterpiece of geometry and malice. We chose a narrow pinch point in the valley, a natural funnel created by a steep limestone ridge on one side and a tangle of dense briar on the other. It was the path of least resistance, and in the wild, even monsters are lazy. They take the road the land offers them. We didn't just dig a hole, we engineered a prison. Thomas and I spent an hour excavating the frozen earth, working in total silence, our breath plumbing in the gray light. We buried the base plate of the snare 6 inches deep, anchoring it to the root system of a 100-year-old oak with galvanized steel stakes. The cable wasn't your standard trapper's wire. It was 7x19 aircraft cable, chemically treated to remove the shine and boiled in walnut husks to kill the metallic tang. It had a breaking strength of 4,000 pounds. Anything that stepped into that loop wasn't just getting caught, it was getting anchored to the bedrock of the earth. I handled the trigger mechanism myself. This was the surgery. I wore elbow-length rubber gauntlets that had been stored in a sealed bag of pine needles for 3 months. One slip, one drop of sweat, one brush of a bare finger, and the trap was useless. These things can smell a fingerprint from 3 days ago. I set the pan tension to 20 pounds. A coyote or a deer could walk right over it without tripping the spring. We needed weight. We needed the heavy, confident footfall of an apex predator. Sandra moved through the periphery like a ghost. She mounted the thermal cameras 12 feet up in the pines, angling them downward to create a crossfire of overlapping fields of view. She used a putty that matched the bark texture to hide the lenses. When she was done, the tech was invisible. If you didn't know where to look, you were being watched by empty trees. Noah applied the lure. He didn't use a pile of meat. Meat attracts scavengers, crows, bears. We wanted a challenge. He used a synthesized territorial pheromone, a musk that mimicked a rival male invading the space. He sprayed it on the trunk of the oak, just above the trap, at a height of 7 feet. It was a direct insult. The creature would have to step forward, rise up on its hind legs to investigate the scent, and that's when the gravity of its own arrogance would trigger the snare. When we were finished, I stood back and looked at the setup. It was invisible. It was deadly. It was perfect. The sun was gone now, the light failing fast, turning the woods into a wall of charcoal and indigo. The temperature was dropping, locking the scent in close to the ground. The stage was set. This was the moment. The plan called for a two-man overwatch. Thomas and I were supposed to stay in the blind on the ridge, while Eric and Noah monitored the feeds from the ATV a mile back. That was the protocol. That was the smart play. But as I looked at the trap, a dark thought curled in the back of my mind. If Thomas was here and the shot had to be taken, who took it? Who got the glory? If we brought this thing down, it would be a shared victory, a committee decision. I looked at Thomas, checking his shotgun. I looked at the rest of them, waiting for my command. "Change of plans," I said. My voice sounded too loud in the stillness. Thomas looked up, his brow furrowing. "What's the play, boss?" "Too much scent," I lied. The words tasted like ash, but they came out smooth. 5 people breathing, shifting, sweating. Even with the blockers, we're a beacon. If this thing is as smart as Noah says, he'll smell the ambush before he sees the bait. Noah adjusted his glasses. "Carlos, the wind is in our favor, the protocol says." "I know what the protocol says," I snapped, cutting him off. "But I've got 15 years of gut instinct that says otherwise. I need zero footprint here. I want everyone back at the base camp. Monitor the feeds. If I give the signal, you come in hot. But until then, I want this valley empty." There was a pause, a heavy, uncomfortable silence. Thomas looked at me, and for a second I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He knew we were secure. He knew the wind was right. He knew I was making a choice based on pride, not tactics. But the hierarchy held. I was the veteran. I was the man with the scar. "You're the boss," Thomas said quietly. He shouldered his shotgun. "Don't miss." "I never do," I said. I watched them pack up and leave. I watched the tail lights of the ATV disappear through the trees, fading into the dark until the sound of the engine was swallowed by the vastness of the forest. I was alone. I climbed up into the tree stand, settled my rifle on the rail, and looked down at the empty clearing. I felt a rush of pure, unadulterated power. This was how it was supposed to be. Man versus beast. 1-on-1. I had sent away my safety net because I wanted the world to know that I didn't need it. I sat there in the dark, waiting for my prize, listening to the wind rattle the dead leaves, completely unaware that I had just dismissed the only people who could have saved me. The silence that follows the departure of a vehicle in the deep woods is heavy enough to crush you. It doesn't just return to quiet. It rushes back in like water filling a vacuum, sudden and absolute. I listened to the engine fade until my ears were straining against the nothingness, and then there was just the wind moving through the canopy and the creaking of the frozen oaks. I was alone. This is the part of the hunt that breaks the amateurs. The waiting. Most people can handle the adrenaline of the chase or the mechanics of the shot, but few can handle the hours of sitting motionless in temperatures that want to kill you. You have to turn yourself into stone. You have to slow your heart rate, control your breathing, and become a void in the landscape. I sat in the tree stand, wrapped in the darkness like a second skin. The cold was a living thing tonight, a biting, malicious presence that sought out every seam in my clothing. But I didn't fight it. I let it settle on me. My flannel was worn thin in places, my heavy jacket frayed at the cuffs, but they were layers I had trusted for years. They held the smell of wood smoke and old sweat, a scent that didn't alarm the woods because it was part of them. I looked down at my boots. They were mud-stained, the leather cracked and resealed a dozen times with mink oil. They weren't the pristine, store-bought tactical gear you see on the guys who make YouTube videos about survival. These were tools. They had walked hundreds of miles of game trails. They had waded through swamps in Louisiana and kicked through shale in the Rockies. They were ugly. And they were perfect. I reached up and traced the line of the scar that cuts through my left eyebrow. It's a jagged ridge of tissue, a souvenir from a fall down a ravine 3 years ago while tracking a cougar. It aches when the pressure drops. I ran my thumb over it, feeling the rough texture of my own history. I wasn't a visitor here. I wasn't a tourist with a camera and a weekend pass. I was part of the ecosystem. I was a predator, just as much as the thing I was waiting for. That arrogance kept me warm. It was a fire in my chest. I looked through the thermal scope, scanning the kill box. The world turned into shades of gray and white. The tree trunks were cold, black pillars. The ground was a uniform dark expanse. Nothing was moving yet. I settled deeper into the collar of my jacket, my steel-gray eyes moving in a slow, rhythmic sweep. Left to right, near to far, check the perimeter, check the trap, repeat. There is a meditative state you enter when you hunt alone. The civilized world, the world of mortgages, traffic, and small talk dissolves. You stop being Carlos Carrillo, the man who pays taxes. You become simply a pair of eyes and a trigger finger. You become a function of the forest. I felt powerful. I felt ancient. I looked at the spot where we had buried the snare, invisible even to my thermal optics, and I imagined the snap, the catch, the victory. I checked my watch. 2 hours had passed since the team left. The moon was rising, casting long, skeletal shadows across the snow. The temperature had dropped another 5 degrees. Most men would be shivering, their teeth chattering, giving away their position with the vibration of their own bodies. I didn't move a muscle. I barely blinked. I was the trap. The cable in the ground was just an extension of my will. I breathed in the cold air, tasting the pine and the decay of the forest floor. I was ready. I was the king of this hill, sitting on my throne of wood and steel, waiting for my subject to arrive and bow before me. I didn't know then that the silence wasn't a sign of my dominance. I didn't know that the woods weren't holding their breath in reverence for me. They were holding their breath because they knew what was coming. It started as a ghost in the machine. One moment, the thermal display was a flat, grainless void of dark blues and blacks. The next, a smudge of heat appeared at the edge of the kill box. It didn't emerge tentatively like a deer testing the wind. It materialized with a horrifying confidence. The heat signature was massive, a towering column of white-hot intensity against the frozen background. My heart hammered against my ribs, a sudden, violent rhythm that threatened to shake the rifle scope. I forced myself to breathe, to lock my muscles. Show me, I thought, show me what you are. The figure moved into the center of the clearing. Through the optic, I watched the mechanics of its gait. It was bipedal, walking with a strange, loping grace, knees bent, shoulders rolled forward. It was huge, easily 7 feet tall, broad at the chest, tapering to a waist that looked disturbingly human. It stopped at the base of the oak tree, right where Noah had sprayed the pheromone. I watched it inhale. Even through the digital screen, I could see the heave of its chest. It was tasting the insult we had left for it. The arrogance of the creature was palpable. It didn't look around. It didn't scan for threats. It believed it owned this valley. It rose to its full height, reaching up a clawed hand to investigate the scent on the bark, and then it took the step. The sound was like a whip crack in a cathedral. Snap! The modified heavy-duty snare fired with enough torque to break a man's leg. The cable whipped tight, the locking mechanism engaged, and the anchor held fast to the earth. The silence of the night was shattered not by a howl, but by a scream. It was a sound that scraped against the bottom of my soul, part guttural roar, part high-pitched shriek, vibrating with a rage that felt almost human. The beast detonated. In the scope, the white form blurred into a frenzy of motion. It threw itself backward, expecting to run, but the cable snapped it back down to the ground. It hit the snow hard, rolled, and sprang up again, thrashing against the tether. I saw the snow around it erupting, clods of frozen earth flying into the air as it tore at the ground. I didn't shoot. I should have. The protocol was clear: confirm target, neutralize target, but I was paralyzed by a drug more potent than any narcotic. I was high on victory. I kept my eye pressed to the scope, drinking it in. For 15 years I had chased shadows. I had cast prints from mud, recorded garbled audio in the deep brush, and interviewed terrified locals who had seen something in the headlights. I had spent half my life hunting ghosts, mist, and folklore. But this was biology, this was physics. I got you, I whispered, the words trembling as they left my mouth. "I got you, you son of a bitch." The creature was fighting the cable with a terrifying power, its heat signature flaring brighter as its exertion spiked. But the trap held. The swivels turned, preventing the wire from kinking. The shock springs absorbed the lunges. It was caught. I lowered the rifle for a split second to look with my naked eyes, just to be sure the thermal wasn't lying to me. Down in the valley, 60 yards away, I could see the dark shape thrashing against the snow, a chaotic shadow trapped in my geometry. I had done it. I had done what the forums said was impossible. I had outsmarted the smartest predator in North America. The validation washed over me in a hot wave. All the money spent, the ruined relationships, the nights shivering in the damp cold, the mockery from the skeptics, it was all worth it for this single second. I raised the rifle again, centering the crosshairs on the chest of the beast, but I didn't squeeze the trigger. I didn't want it to end yet. I wanted to see it. I wanted to look it in the eye before I put it down. I wanted the trophy to know who had beaten it. 15 years of ghosts, I said aloud to the empty tree stand, a grin stretching across my face that felt manic. And I finally have a body. I was the apex predator now, the king of the woods. I unclipped my safety harness, my movements fluid and confident. I was going down there. I was going to finish this close up. The descent from the tree stand felt less like climbing down a ladder and more like descending from a throne. My boots hit the frozen earth with a heavy, deliberate thud. I should have stayed up there. Wilson would have screamed at me until his throat bled. You never leave the high ground until the target is confirmed dead. That was rule number 1. But I wasn't listening to Wilson anymore. I was listening to the pounding drum of my own ego. I adjusted the sling of my rifle, keeping the stock tight against my shoulder, and began to walk toward the kill box. The snow crunched loudly under my feet, a sound that would usually make me cringe, but tonight I didn't care about noise discipline. I wanted it to hear me coming. I wanted this thing to know that I was the one closing the distance. The clearing was bathed in a spectral, blue-gray light from the moon. Ahead of me, the massive white shape was still thrashing, a blur of fur and muscle fighting against the unyielding steel of the aircraft cable. I could hear the snap hiss of the wire pulling tight, the heavy panting of the creature, and the dull thud of its body hitting the ground as it threw itself against the tether. I moved with a swagger that I'm ashamed to admit now. I was walking toward my coronation. I stopped about 20 yards out. The smell hit me first, a thick, musky odor that was like wet dog mixed with copper and something else, something old and rotten like damp earth in a cellar. It was the smell of a predator that didn't clean itself because it didn't have to. "Done running," I said, my voice cutting through the cold air. And then it stopped. It didn't collapse from exhaustion. It didn't whimper or curl up in defeat. It simply ceased moving. 1 second it was a chaotic storm of violence, and the next, it was as still as the statues in a graveyard. The abrupt silence was jarring. My grip tightened on the rifle. I expected it to be winded, to be heaving for air, but as I took another step closer, bringing me within 30 feet, I saw that it was perfectly calm. The beast was crouched on all fours, its massive white coat blending with the snow, but its outline was unmistakable. It was huge, the muscles in its shoulders bunched and tight, but it wasn't pulling away from me anymore. It had turned. It was facing me. I raised the rifle, centering the scope on its head, but I kept both eyes open. I needed to see this for real. I clicked on the tactical light mounted to the barrel. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the creature in harsh, blinding detail. It raised its head slowly, squinting against the lumen blast. I had expected fear. I had hunted bears, cougars, wolves. I knew what a trapped animal looked like. They look frantic. Their eyes roll back, they foam at the mouth, they radiate a pure, instinctual panic. They bargain with the trap, biting at their own limbs to get free. But the eyes that stared back at me weren't panicked. They were amber, glowing in the reflection of my light, with pupils that had pinpointed into sharp, vertical slits. There was no foam, no frantic panting. The creature was breathing in slow, measured RH thems. Steam curled lazily from its nostrils, rising into the night air like smoke from a pipe. It looked at the rifle. Then it looked at me. It tilted its head slightly to the side, a gesture that was so unnervingly human it made my stomach turn over. A cold prickle of unease started at the base of my spine. The rush of victory began to curdle into something else. Why wasn't it fighting? Why wasn't it trying to rip the stake out of the ground? It sat back on its haunches, the cable slackening just a fraction. It didn't look like a prisoner. It looked like a patient in a waiting room. The expression on its face, if you could call it a face, wasn't anger. It was expectancy. It looked at me with a chilling, intelligent patience, as if I were the one who was late to the meeting, as if it had been waiting for me to step out of the trees and stand exactly where I was standing. I took a half step back, the snow crunching under my heel. The creature's lips curled back, not in a snarl, but in something that looked horrifyingly like a grin. It knew something I didn't. And in that moment, standing 10 yards away from a monster that should have been terrified of me, I finally realized that the silence in the woods wasn't a tribute to my skill. It was the quiet before the hammer falls. The stare of the beast held me like a magnet. It was a hypnotic, amber tether that made the rest of the world blur at the edges. I was so focused on the creature, on its unnatural calm, its impossible posture, that I almost missed the change in the world around me. It wasn't a sound that alerted me. It was the absence of one. The woods, which had been filled with the subtle white noise of winter, the creaking of frozen branches, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of dry leaves, suddenly went dead. It was as if someone had cut the audio cable to reality. The silence was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed against my eardrums. In that vacuum, I felt it. A puff of air, a gentle, freezing breeze that brushed against the back of my sweaty neck. My stomach dropped through the floor of the valley. I had been so obsessed with the kill, so drunk on my own glory, that I hadn't checked the wind since I climbed down. The thermal drift had shifted. The air was no longer hitting me in the face. It was pushing against my back. I wasn't just standing in the open, I was a beacon. The wind was carrying my scent, my sweat, the gun oil, the stale coffee on my breath, directly behind me, up the slope, back toward the ridge I had just foolishly abandoned. Wilson's voice screamed in my head, loud and furious. If the wind shifts, you move. If you stay, you die. I tore my eyes away from the trapped beast. The creature hadn't moved, but that grin seemed wider now, a rictus of knowing mockery. It wasn't waiting for me to shoot. It was waiting for the rest of the choir to join the song. Crack! The sound came from behind me. It was loud, deliberate. It wasn't the soft rustle of a squirrel or the random settling of the ice. It was the sound of heavy weight coming down on dry wood. It came from the ridge. It came from the exact spot where my tree stand was. My blood ran cold, turning to slush in my veins. I realized with a sick, vertiginous horror that something was up there. Something was sitting in the seat I had kept warm for 4 hours. While I was down here gloating over the pawn, the king had taken the castle. I started to turn, my boots catching in the snow, bringing the rifle around. Snap! To my left, closer, maybe 40 yards out, just inside the tree line where the shadows were thickest. I froze. My tactical light swung wildly, the beam cutting through the darkness, but the trees swallowed the light. Grrrr rumble. To my right, this one wasn't a stick breaking. It was a low, vibrating resonance that I felt in my chest more than I heard with my ears. It was a growl, deep and subsonic, the sound of a tectonic plate shifting. It came from the briar patch, the wall of the funnel I had used to guide the prey into the trap. I was spinning now, trying to look everywhere at once, the rifle feeling useless and heavy in my hands. The geometry of the kill box clicked into place in my mind, but the diagram had flipped. I wasn't the trapper, I was the bait. The trapped male in front of me hadn't been caught by mistake. He was the distraction. He was the sacrifice piece on the chessboard, sent out to draw the queen into the middle of the board. They had watched us set the trap. They had watched the team leave. They had watched me sit in the tree for hours, patient and disciplined, waiting for me to make the one mistake that arrogance always guarantees. They waited for me to come down to the ground. I was surrounded. High ground, left flank, right flank. The silence wasn't empty, it was full of eyes. I stood alone in the center of the snowy amphitheater, the wind betraying me, the darkness closing in, and I finally understood what the trapped beast had been smiling about. He wasn't the one who was going to die tonight. I looked back at the creature in the trap. In the harsh glare of my tactical light, the perspective shifted. Panic has a way of clarifying things, of stripping away the romance of the hunt and leaving only the cold, hard data. I looked at its shoulders, its muzzle, the set of its eyes. My brain, now screaming with adrenaline, finally processed what my ego had refused to see. It was young. Despite its size, despite the terrifying power it had used to thrash against the cable, this wasn't an elder. The teeth were too white, the coat too clean, the muscle mass undefined compared to the monsters Wilson had described to me. It wasn't the king of the valley, it was a pawn, it was the runt. The realization hit me harder than the cold. A pack of wolves will sometimes exile a weak member, or worse, use them. They had offered up the lowest member of their hierarchy as a sacrifice. They knew that a hunter, a human with a gun and a god complex, would focus entirely on the struggle in front of him. They knew I would stare at the shiny object and ignore the shadows. I swung my rifle up, pressing my eye to the thermal scope one last time. I needed to see them. I needed to know the shape of my death. I swept the ridge first, the high ground I had abandoned. The thermal display flared a blinding, saturated white. There was a heat signature sitting directly in my tree stand. It was massive, dwarfing the one in the trap. The shoulders were broad enough to block out the trunk of the oak behind it. It was sitting there, calm, watching me through the very gap in the branches I had cut earlier that day. It had taken my throne. I swung the rifle left. 2 more signatures. They were low to the ground, moving through the brush in a crouch, ghosting between the trees. They weren't charging, they were sliding into position. I swung right. 2 more. These were closer, standing upright behind the briar patch, their heat signatures glowing like demons against the cold backdrop of the woods. 5 plus the one in the trap makes 6. They weren't just attacking, they were executing a complex tactical maneuver. They had established a perimeter, seized the high ground for oversight, and deployed flankers to cut off my lateral escape routes. This wasn't animal instinct. This was infantry doctrine. This was a kill box, and I was standing in the center of it. "They're hurting me," I whispered. The words tasted like bile. The growl from the ridge grew louder, a command rolling down the hillside. The flankers moved in response, stepping closer, tightening the noose. They didn't want to rush in and risk a lucky shot from my .338 Lapua. They wanted to squeeze me. They wanted to drive me into panic, make me run, and then take me down from behind like a fleeing deer. I looked down at the trapped runt one last time. It was watching me with those slit-pupiled eyes. It knew. The anticipation in its posture was gone, replaced by a smug, silent satisfaction. It bared its teeth, not in a threat but in a taunt. My finger hovered over the trigger. I wanted to kill it. God, I wanted to kill it. I wanted to put a bullet through its chest and take at least one of them with me. My pride demanded it. I had spent 15 years waiting for this moment, and the thought of leaving this creature alive, leaving my trap behind, leaving my victory, it was physically painful. But the math was absolute. If I took the shot, the recoil would knock me off target for a second. The report would deafen me. And in that second, the 5 monsters closing in would be on me. A bullet for the runt was a trade for my life. I lowered the rifle. The shame was hotter than the thermal scope. I was letting it go. I was leaving the proof, the trophy, the vindication. "You win," I hissed at the creature in the snow. The runt let out a short, sharp bark. It sounded like a laugh. I didn't wait for the punchline. I turned my back on the trap, my back on the prize, and I did the only thing a prey animal can do when the walls are closing in. I ran. I didn't run with the tactical precision of a soldier. I didn't retreat with covering fire. I scrambled. I threw myself toward the only gap in the line, the narrow, rocky creek bed that led back toward the ATV trail. It was the only direction where I hadn't seen a heat signature, which probably meant they wanted me to go that way. They were funneling me. But I had no choice. I hit the snow sprinting, my heavy boots slipping on the ice, the rifle banging against my ribs. Behind me, the silence of the woods shattered. A chorus of howls erupted, not the lonely, mournful call of a wolf, but a cacophony of screams, barks, and deep, chest-rattling roars. The pack was off the leash. The hunt was on. The creek bed was a graveyard of slick limestone and hidden ice, a jagged scar running through the valley floor. I hit it at a dead sprint, my boots scrabbling for purchase, every slip sending a jolt of terror up my spine. Behind me, the woods were being dismantled. It wasn't just the sound of pursuit, it was the sound of an avalanche. The crashing of timber, the heavy, rhythmic thudding of paws that sounded like war drums, and the snarls that seemed to originate from every direction at once. They weren't just chasing me, they were driving me. My breath came in ragged, burning gasps, the cold air searing my lungs like inhaled glass. The weight on my back, my custom .338 Lapua, the thermal optic, the bipod, felt like an anchor. It was 12 pounds of precision engineering that I had spent years saving for, a symbol of my status as a hunter. Now it was just a death sentence. I could hear the flankers closing in on the ridges above the creek. They were matching my pace, loping effortlessly through the deep snow while I stumbled and fought for every yard. I was losing ground. I made the choice in a split second. I didn't think about the cost. I didn't think about the insurance. I unbuckled the sling. I let the rifle fall. I heard it clatter against the frozen rocks, $8,000 of steel and glass abandoned in the mud. I didn't look back. I shed my pack next, the survival kit, the extra ammo, the expensive knives. I stripped myself down to just the clothes on my back and the knife on my belt. I wasn't a hunter anymore. I was prey, and prey has to be light to survive. Ahead of me, through the break in the trees, I saw the twin beams of headlights cutting through the swirling snow. "Eric," I screamed, my voice cracking. Eric Cook was waiting at the extraction point with the snowmobiles idling. He must have heard the howls. He must have heard the chaos. He was standing on the seat of his machine, waving his arms, his face a mask of pale terror illuminated by the dash lights. "Run, Carlos, run." I burst out of the tree line, my legs pumping like pistons, my chest heaving. The distance between me and the machine was 50 yards, 40, 30. I could feel the heat of them behind me now. I could smell the musk, heavy and rotten. I didn't dare turn my head. I dove the last 10 feet, slamming chest first onto the seat of my snowmobile. "Go, go, go," I roared, hammering the throttle before I was even fully seated. The engine screamed, the track biting into the hard-packed snow. The machine fishtailed violently, throwing up a rooster tail of ice, and then launched forward. Eric was right beside me, his engine whining in protest as we tore away from the tree line. I risked a look back. The memory of what I saw is what wakes me up at 3:00 a.m., soaked in sweat. They broke the tree line just as we hit top speed. 5 of them. They didn't stop at the edge of the woods. They poured out onto the open snow, massive, hulking shapes moving with terrifying speed. The alpha, the one from the ridge, was in the lead. He stood fully 7 feet tall, running on two legs, his eyes glowing like embers in the red tail lights of our machines. He watched us go. He didn't look exhausted. He looked like a king dismissing a jester from his court. He stopped, threw his head back, and let out a howl that vibrated through the frame of the snowmobile, a sound of absolute, uncontested dominance. We rode in silence for an hour, pushing the machines until the engine smelled like burning rubber, not stopping until we hit the county road and saw the lights of a gas station. We didn't speak. We didn't have to. We both knew that we hadn't escaped because we were fast. We had escaped because they let us leave. I'm back in the cabin now. The fire is dying down and the whiskey bottle is empty. I never went back to Morrow's property. I told him to sell the land, to burn the farmhouse, to walk away and never look back. I don't know if he listened. I never went back for the trap. Somewhere in that valley, buried under a season of snow and rust, is a heavy-duty aircraft cable snare. Maybe it's still holding the skeleton of a runt. Maybe the pack figured out how to spring it. And somewhere in the creek bed lies my rifle, rusting into the earth, a monument to my own stupidity. People ask me why I didn't go back with a bigger team, why I didn't go back with helicopters or thermal drones or a militia. They ask me why I let them win. They don't understand. I didn't let them win. I survived their game. So for those of you listening, the ones who want to buy the gear and head out into the dark places to find glory, listen to me. There are things in the woods that are older than us, stronger than us, and smarter than us. They know the terrain because they are the terrain. You can buy the best technology money can offer. You can train until your hands bleed. You can hunt them. You can even trap them. But don't ever, for 1 second, think you're the one in control. Good night and keep the lights on.